Some of the most intense persecution against Christians in decades is happening right now in China. And according to Bob Fu of China Aid, it may be the most opposition the church has faced since the communist revolution led by Chairman Mao Zedong back in the 1960s. Bob Fu is the founder and president of China Aid. He is one of the leading voices in the world for the persecuted faith communities in China. Bob Fu is also a house church leader in Beijing until he and his wife Heidi were imprisoned for 2 months for illegal evangelism in 1996. Bob and Heidi fled to the United States as religious refugees in 1997 and then started China Aid in 2002 to bring international attention to China's gross human rights violations and promote religious freedom and rule of law in China. Bob, good to have you with me today.
Thank you, Greg, for having me again.
Now, we are hearing so many stories of what's going on in China in terms of persecution. And we were just on a conference call recently, and you said this is some of the worst that you have seen since the 1960s.
It is the worst since the Cultural Revolution of Chairman Mao in 1960s. And Greg, we used to talk about persecution because of not registration in the government. Persecution because the church has grown too fast or too big. But now, under this pretext of COVID-19 coronavirus, the Chinese Communist Party has intensified its persecution by banning all the church activities, even those services or worship or prayer meetings in believers' own homes with their own family members. And even to call for a prayer meeting online is declared illegal and subject the believers for detention.
Why are they doing that, Bob? I mean, why is that happening now? Why is there this thrust of persecution against Christians and the clampdown?
There are kind of a few factors. Number one, of course, the Chinese Communist Party took advantage of this COVID-19 coronavirus by telling believers, of course, including the government-sanctioned churches, stop gathering, and even among like family members, and no more gathering in the name of coronavirus prevention. And number two is really contribute to the newly effected regulation on religious affairs. The government had been engaging this so-called Sinicization campaign. The Sinicization is nothing but the falsification, to be like anybody has to be compatible with communist ideology. If a believer or clergyman in the government-sanctioned church is found not complying to the total absolute loyalty to the Communist Party leader Xi Jinping, and ironically, Xi Jinping's portrait was even put on the church pulpit along with Chairman Mao. And the first line item of worship, by the government-sanctioned church before COVID-19 was to sing a Communist Party's national anthem. So this is called the Sinicization. Like, to be like Chinese has to be like identify with the Chinese Communist Party. So that's an ideological adherence requirement. Make this persecution very, very worse than the previous times.
Is that why the crosses have been taken down all over the country as well, Bob? Because they see Christianity as opposing their ideology?
You're right, Greg. This new wave of persecution actually started in 2015 when the first wave of cross demolition and forced cross destruction, and thousands of crosses were torn down, burned out, and destroyed from the rooftop of the church buildings. I mean, you remember most of these churches are government-sanctioned churches because the house church usually do not have a legitimate building. So, I mean, this is certainly a new feature to show that the Communist Party had just even started the targeting the persecution against its own supposedly registered, legal, and protected government patriotic churches. And then after this COVID-19 happens, they have more excuses and more pretexts to ban everyone from even worshiping online.
Now, the underground churches or the house churches have been persecuted for decades. And yet, in spite of all that, there's been incredible growth. But now the government, as you mentioned, targeting the government churches, the three self-patriotic churches. Why are they coming at them so hard now, too? Because, I mean, they've had somewhat control over these churches.
It has to do with the rapid growth of Christian faith. And of course, the absolute requirement to comply to the Communist Party leader Xi Jinping's new ideology, for total unconditional submission and loyalty to himself. Of course, the party ideology has become, more and more harsher in its implementation. So, that's why I think this new wave of persecution is the worst since the end of, or even the beginning of Cultural Revolution. We have seen even millions of children. We know the revival has been happening, since the 1949 when Communist Party took power, and China has become, if not the most rapid growth church, at least one of the top, we're competing with churches in Iran. And but God has been moving amazingly in China. Of course, the devil and of course especially the Communist Party, who are so jealous of the kind of church influence. And look, the church has now taken the role of taking care of the needy, the poor, the elderly, and also help relief on the on some like natural disasters, earthquake, and during the pandemic. Ironically, many of the churches, like in Wuhan, the epidemic center, and the original location where the coronavirus started, church were receiving the heaviest persecution just because they are doing good work. They're doing huge charitable work. And one of the churches in Wuhan, after they distributed hundreds of thousands of face masks to the passengers on the road, and with the gospel tracts and PPEs, and then the government started cracking down against them by confiscating about 5 million worth of US dollars medical supplies from them. So become a charitable is a crime in this sense. So that is how the Communist Party's ideology took precedent on anything. So they are very, in that sense, the Communist Party's new ideology is very religious, very exclusive. They don't want to have anyone, any organization, any individual institutions to be seen as a rival to their total control of every aspect of society, including your belief.
Now, the church, as we know, Bob, is often at its best when there are crisis situations, and people can say a lot of things about, against the church, but that's when the church is at its best. Now, as you mentioned, in Wuhan, where the virus broke out, there's a church there called Fellowship of Righteousness, Pastor Luha, and he was just participating in a Zoom call like we're having right now with other leaders, talking about the gospel and helping out in times of crisis. And he gets taken away for questioning. So even being online now, is that considered something the government's just not going to put up with when it comes to Christians?
Yes, Greg. The new feature of the crackdown under the pretext of COVID-19 is like what Pastor Luo had experienced, and it has been reported in other parts of China all over. The churches just because engaging Zoom or other online platform of worship is declared illegal and subject for persecution and prosecution. So that's what I call it's a digital tyrannical kind of dictatorship.
Wow. And I mean, when you look at these kind of situations, is it to intimidate, this pastor and other Christian leaders and other followers of Jesus? Because if you're on a Zoom call or video conferencing or having a small meeting and government people can come in, I mean, how does that affect the psyche of the church? Are they always looking over their shoulder?
Well, China officially, of course, has entered into a digital authoritarianism age, right? By 2025, the estimated number of face recognition cameras in China will reach to 2.7 billion. So that means every Chinese out of 1.4 billion in China, there are 2 face recognition cameras with their AI technology chasing and monitoring you wherever you go. So that certainly impacts the church, and all the online platforms have been closely monitored and followed. That's why Pastor Guo and Pastor Luo's church, and so does the Chengdu's Early Rain Covenant Church, and many other churches. I mean, even my hometown city, province, Shandong, brother, just simply calling for a 9-day fast and prayer meeting on a Chinese WeChat kind of social media platform, suffered 1 day, like 24-hour administrative detention. And the officials basically told him it's not allowed to engage online prayer meeting, period. So this is, it will have an impact. I think the Chinese church, as you just mentioned, had been subjecting persecution for so long in all kinds of forms. So this is the digital kind of form of persecution is not exception. I think the church will adapt accordingly, and we will continue to expect the church revival will persist.
Well, I mean, and that's one of the hallmarks of the revival that's happened in China. And I think we talked, not that long ago, and I think by 2030, you're expecting well over 200 million Christians, and persecution can actually speed things up. I mean, again, we're going to do the best that we can when it comes to, getting the word out in terms of the persecution and praying and helping and, partnering with organizations like yours. But the reality is, when this persecution comes, at least that has been the history in China and other countries, as you mentioned, Iran earlier, where this persecution seems to spark revival, and it just causes people to become even more passionate in their faith in Jesus.
Amen. Yes, that's right. The Purdue University from Indiana, released that study about the religious growth in the past 100 years in China. They projected, of course, they realized and concluded the number of Chinese Christians now has already reached to 130 million. And by 2030, the number will be inevitably reached to at least 224 million. So China is destined to become the first, the largest Christianized nation, and the persecution by the Communist Party will help advance and accelerate that. So at the end of the day, we may have to thank President Xi Jinping for his help for advancing the growth of the church. He has no time to regret, and we will continue to pray for him for his redemption as well.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. I mean, when you think about how God uses all things to advance the kingdom and his church. There's a recent report from the U.S. State Department and their annual report on international religious freedom, and they had a lengthy section on the freedom of religion and violations by the Chinese government. But these things, Bob, don't seem to affect the way that China continues to persecute Christians.
It does not affect this current regime under President Xi Jinping. Apparently, his heart is pretty much hardened to ban. I think the next phase will ban Christian faith, just all over. I think he may be lost a pharaoh for China. And I think the international community still, however, need to speak up because this is not out of just a human rights concern of one government policy. It is a kind of a moral, spiritual imperative as we, at least, Christian community know that Hebrew 13:3, we should remember those who are in bond as if we are bonded and fellow prisoners like them. And one part of the body suffer, the whole body suffer. So I think we should continue to speak up, to act up, and to help up.
Bob, always good to see you. Keep up the great work that you're doing in China, keeping us aware. And again, we appreciate our partnership with you at Voice of the Martyrs Canada. And thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Greg. We are always grateful for the partnership from you guys. Yeah.
God bless you, man.
Bless you too.